The rain had begun as a polite persuasion, soft taps at the panes of the coaching inn, as though the night itself meant to be admitted. By the time the last carriage wheel splashed through the rutted lane, it had become something more insistent. It worried at the thatch, flung itself against the coach-house door, and turned the road into a restless ribbon of mud. Celestine Wraxby stepped down from the carriage with the careful composure of a woman who had learned, early, that grace could be a form of armor. She wore a pelisse that had once been a shade of sober cream, but now bore the unmistakable evidence of travel, dark smears at the hem, and a rain-dampened collar that refused to dry. Her gloves were already spotted with the clay that had leapt up from the road when the coach stopped too abruptly. 3 days. The words returned to her mind with every swallow. 3 days before the entail took hold. 3 days before the men in black went from polite letters to actual possession. It was absurd, almost vulgar, how quickly a woman's life could be reduced to a legal instrument, as if her mind and will were no more relevant than a cracked teacup. She had been advised to flee to London, of course. London was always where people suggested refuge when they wished her to solve problems by spending money she did not have. She had instead traveled to this coaching inn because an old friend of her mother's had once used a certain back channel, a certain solicitor who owed favors to the dead and the living in equal measure. Now she was here, inside a hallway that smelled of wet wool, chimney smoke, and the faintly sour tang of old beer. Above the hearth, the inn's sign had been painted with a cheery horse and a cheerful motto that promised safety. Celestine suspected the horse had never stood in the rain long enough to understand it. The innkeeper, Eleanor, with a voice like a pressed seam and eyes that missed nothing, took Celestine's shawl with hands that were neither unkind nor slow. "You'll be staying, miss. The road's not a road tonight. It's a quagmire pretending to be one." Celestine set her traveling reticule onto a chair. She did not look down at the wet floor. She looked at Eleanor. "I am afraid the journey's already taken its liberties with my person. It has cost me my appointment." Eleanor's expression tightened, not with sympathy but with calculation. "An appointment with a gentleman?" It was the kind of question that could be asked as jest, yet delivered as a hook. Celestine felt it catch in her ribs. "With an attorney," she said, and allowed the word to land with proper weight. Eleanor's gaze shifted toward the staircase, where a door had been propped open against the warmth of the common room. "Well, the gentleman already here seems to be in need of an attorney as well." Celestine followed her glance and saw, at the end of the room, a tall figure half-turned from the fire. He wore dark clothing that drank the candlelight rather than reflected it. His coat was too fine for an ordinary guest of an ordinary coaching inn, and yet the roughness of travel clung to him, water in his hair, mud at the base of his boots, a certain stiffness in his shoulders, as though he had been riding hard. He was holding a folded document, or perhaps a map. The paper was handled with care, the way one might touch evidence. Celestine's first instinct was to pity him for arriving at such a miserable hour. Her second instinct, newer, sharper, was to distrust him for looking as if he knew more than he should. The common room was already filling with small tragedies: a young footman whispering too loudly to a maid, a pair of country gentlemen arguing about oats, and, somewhere near the hearth, a man laughing with a force that suggested relief rather than mirth. Gossip, Celestine had always learned, did not require proof, it only required proximity. Eleanor led her to a narrow chamber upstairs. "A room with a lock," Eleanor said, as if it were a luxury to be celebrated. "And if you hear any knocking, mind it may be the storm's own bones." Celestine's chamber was clean enough, though the bed linen smelled faintly of lavender and old soap. A small wash basin sat on the side table with a pitcher that had been brought hours before. A single candle waited in a brass holder, its flame already dancing in the draught. Celestine set her reticule down and began to unpack with deliberate economy. She was not a woman without agency. If anything, her agency had been honed into something precise by years of living under other people's expectations. She arranged the papers she carried in a sequence she could recognize blindfolded. her mother's letter, her own notebook of dates and recollections, and the attorney's correspondence that had led her here. She was not, she told herself firmly, a woman who could be frightened into surrender. Yet when the knock came, 2 quick taps, then a pause, she felt the quiet shudder of dread. It was not loud. It was not impolite. It was, however, too confident. She opened the door only enough to see the corridor. A man stood there. Not Eleanor, not the inn's assistant. The tall figure from the common room, soaked at the collar, his hair darkened by rain, his eyes fixed on her as if he had already read the outcome and was only now arriving at the moment. "Miss," he said, and the word was correct in its tone but incorrect in its intimacy. Celestine kept her hands on the edge of the door. "You have the wrong chamber." "I have not." His voice was low, roughened by travel and perhaps something else. "My name is Malcolm Ainsworth. I was given reason to believe an attorney's letter might be addressed to you at this inn." Celestine's mind moved with the speed of caution. "Who gave you that reason?" He hesitated, just slightly. It would have been nothing to a less observant woman. To Celestine, it was proof of guilt. "A man on the road," Malcolm said. "A messenger. He spoke of your circumstances." Celestine did not ask how he knew her circumstances. She did not ask what messenger. She did not ask if the man had stopped him and searched his coat for receipts. She already knew the answers were likely unsatisfactory. "Mr. Ainsworth," she said, taking care to pronounce it fully so that distance could be heard. "I have no appointment with you." His gaze slid past her shoulder into the room, catching on the papers laid neatly across her table. It was not a scandalous look. It was, however, a penetrating one. "I'm not here to court you," Malcolm said, as though it were an accusation she might throw. "I'm here because the storm means the innkeeper will keep you, and because I require information that will not survive another delay." Celestine's patience thinned. "Then you require an attorney as well." He met her eyes. "I require a person, and that person is you, if the letter I hold is correct." He held up a folded sheet. Celestine saw the seal, dark wax, an imprint of a ringed crest she recognized from the correspondence she had brought with her. Her stomach tightened. "How did you get that?" she demanded. Malcolm's mouth tightened, as if he disliked the question yet knew it deserved answering. "I took it from a courier's possession when he fell. The road, the rain. A man cannot always afford propriety." It was, Celestine realized, an excuse. It was also, perhaps, a confession. She should have closed the door. She should have turned Eleanor's attention to the matter and demanded he leave. Instead, she felt a more dangerous curiosity, the one that told her the entail's timing was not accidental and that some part of her life had been arranged by hands she did not yet know. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the candle flame. "If what I suspect is true, then you have 3 days from the moment you arrive, not from the date written on the entail." Celestine went still. The air between them cooled. "Why?" she asked, because if she did not ask, she would think herself mad with silence. "Because," he said, and lowered his voice further, "someone has already set the machinery in motion. Your legal claim is not being tested, it is being harvested." Harvested. Celestine tasted the word and found it bitter. She stepped away from the door and gestured just once to her table. "Then put it down," she said, and there was steel in her tone. "And explain yourself fully to the innkeeper when she chooses to listen." Malcolm entered. The room was small. His presence made it smaller. He moved as if aware of his own bulk and yet unable to soften it. He placed the sealed letter on her table without breaking it. Celestine studied the wax imprint again. "This is the solicitor's signature." "Yes." "And you—" She stopped herself, not because she lacked questions, but because she feared the answers. Malcolm's jaw flexed. "I am not a villain, if that is what you suspect." I have no interest in harming you. That is not what I asked, Celestine replied. I asked why it was in your possession. His gaze held hers with a stubbornness that felt practiced. Because the messenger was not headed to you, he said. He was headed to the same person who wishes to claim your estate. He carried your letter as bait. Celestine's mind spun. A baited letter meant surveillance, means, and time. Someone had anticipated her route. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook, paper bending slightly under her grip. Then you intend to undo it? I intend to stop it, Malcolm said, and I intend to do so before your name becomes a joke at some gentleman's table. Celestine did not miss the implication. She did not want the joke. She had lived too long among people who believed tragedy was a form of entertainment. I will undo nothing for you, she said, and her voice became careful. If you are involved, speak plainly. If you are not, you should leave. Malcolm's gaze dropped to her hands, perhaps noticing the pressure she was applying to her notebook. Something in him softened and then hardened again, as though he battled himself. I'm involved, he admitted. Not in your ruin, in my own. Celestine waited, refusing to rescue him with questions. Malcolm exhaled. There are debts in my name. There are men who believe I can purchase silence with charm. I have been wrong about what silence costs. A strange honesty sat in his words. It was not comforting. It was only more unsettling. Celestine lifted her chin. And you believe my circumstances are tied to your debts? Yes. Malcolm's eyes met hers again. And I believe your mother left instructions that would, if followed, put those debts in the grave rather than in my hands. Celestine's heart tightened at the mention of her mother. She had kept the memory of her mother like a secret charm, something she held close so no one else could determine her worth. Those instructions, she said, are in my possession, and they remain mine. Malcolm's gaze sharpened. Then you will share them with me, if you wish to stop the entail. Celestine's temper flickered. You will not command me. I'm not commanding you, Malcolm said. I'm bargaining with what little time you have. At that, her agency returned with a force that surprised her even as she welcomed it. She had bargained all her life, though usually with herself, not another. Then bargain, she said, but understand this. My price is truth. Malcolm's throat worked. Truth, then. He leaned slightly forward, as if proximity might make sincerity easier. There is a man, he began, who holds a portion of your entail's leverage. He is also a man who once kept my father's papers in his counting house. When my father died, that man promised restitution. He did not make it. He made excuses instead. Celestine listened. Her intelligence did not need melodrama. It needed structure. Malcolm spoke with fragments at first. Then, as he realized she would not interrupt him, he laid the story in careful sequence. He mentioned a solicitor with a cheerful smile and a cruel reputation. He mentioned an estate boundary line that had always been too convenient. He mentioned a pocket of documents that had gone missing from his father's trunk, documents that he believed belonged to Celestine's mother. Celestine's pulse steadied. The puzzle assembled itself in her mind. And the messenger, she said, was sent to retrieve my letter as bait to draw me to a compromise, something that would allow them to argue I consented to the claim. Malcolm nodded once, sharply. Yes. Celestine's eyes narrowed. Then the compromise they seek is not physical, she said, thinking fast. Not necessarily. It could be something worse, a scandal witnessed by the wrong people, a rumor that would make the courts reluctant to believe my word. Malcolm's mouth tightened. Exactly. Celestine stood and stepped toward the wash basin. She wet her hands and then dried them slowly, as if preparing for a task rather than a threat. If they intend to fabricate a compromise, then we will deny them the opportunity, she said. Can you? Malcolm asked, and the doubt in his tone was honest and infuriating. This is an inn. Doors don't stay shut. People listen without permission. Celestine turned back, her gaze level. Then we will behave in a way that leaves no room for fabrication. Malcolm's eyes widened just slightly. It was the first time she had seen him truly consider her as an equal rather than as a piece to move. Perhaps, he said. She moved back to her table. You will sit. You will sit, Celestine repeated, with the authority of a woman who had spent years negotiating with men who believed themselves sovereign. And you will not leave this room until Eleanor says the messenger has been found. Malcolm looked at her as though she had just demanded the moon. Then he complied. They spent the next hour turning over details, names, dates, routes. Celestine's mind became a ledger, and Malcolm's became a confession. Yet every time they approached the heart of the matter, something interrupted. A gust of wind at the window, a distant shout in the common room, the inn's floorboards creaking as if someone else moved overhead. At last, the clock, an ugly thing with a face the color of old bone, struck 10. Celestine exhaled. We cannot remain awake all night, she said. If Eleanor's servants bring water, we will request additional candles. Otherwise you sleep, Malcolm finished, as if the word frightened him. And in the morning we speak with Eleanor, and we demand the courier's papers be returned. And if the courier's papers are gone? Celestine asked. Malcolm's gaze drifted to the locked chest in her corner. Then we retrieve them before the law retrieves you. Before Celestine could answer, a sound came from the corridor. A pause, then the unmistakable rattle of a latch. Eleanor's voice drifted up, sharp and controlled. Miss Celestine, are you awake? There's a gentleman at the stair with a message. He says it concerns your... The message did not finish. The innkeeper's voice cut off as abruptly as if someone had placed a hand over her words. Celestine's blood cooled. Malcolm sprang up from his chair. Stay here, he said. I do not take orders, Celestine replied. He moved anyway, toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Celestine followed, not because she wanted proximity to danger, but because she needed to see the angle of it. When Malcolm opened the door, the corridor was empty. But something was wrong. The air held a faint scent of perfume, sweet, powdery, wrong for rain and wool. It clung to the corridor as though someone had passed quickly with expensive intentions. Celestine's gaze dropped to the floor. A calling card lay half under the stair rail, its edges damp. The card was printed with black type and a name in a font too elegant to be honest. Celestine saw the crest. Her stomach tightened. Malcolm picked it up carefully, as if expecting it to bite. He read the name and then looked at Celestine with a grimness that made his flaws feel like part of the threat. This is not a solicitor, he said. It is the man behind the leverage, Celestine whispered. She snatched the card from Malcolm's hand, her fingers trembling with anger. He came here personally. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the candlelight within her room. And he came with a woman, or intended to. Celestine's jaw set. They are attempting to create a witness. Malcolm inhaled slowly. Then we must stop them before they succeed. Celestine's pride flared. We will stop them by locking doors. Malcolm let out a brief laugh that held no humor. Locks don't stop people who mean to be believed. The next morning arrived like a reluctant visitor. Dawn was gray and thin, the sky without mercy. Eleanor appeared in the corridor with tea and a face set to neutrality. Breakfast, she said, as though the word could push away scandal. Celestine's chamber felt too small after the night's tension. She sat at her chair with tea she could not taste. Malcolm remained standing by the window, rain still glistening on the glass. Eleanor watched them both, her eyes too sharp for comfort. There was a woman last night, Eleanor said quietly. She asked for you, miss. She claimed she knew you, claimed you had been careless with a card. Celestine's fingers tightened around her cup. What did you say? "That you were asleep," Eleanor replied. Celestine released a slow breath. "Thank you." Eleanor's mouth twitched faintly. It wasn't kindness. Celestine met her eyes. Then what was it? Eleanor sipped her tea. It was fear. "Fear of what?" Malcolm asked. Eleanor's gaze sharpened toward him. "Fear of what a man like that will do with rumors if he is denied access." Celestine set her cup down with a controlled clink. "Then he will return." Eleanor nodded. "He already plans to." Before Celestine could ask how Eleanor knew, the common room below filled with footsteps. A door opened. Someone called out a name too loudly. And then, as if the inn itself had decided to participate in cruelty, Celestine heard the unmistakable sound of laughter, followed by a woman's voice, bright, practiced, and certain of being overheard. "Miss Wraxby," the voice called, "how I hoped you would have the sense to remain in your room. Men are so careless with invitations." Celestine's face went hot. She rose. "Who is she?" Eleanor didn't answer at first. Then she said softly, "Lady Seraphine Locksley." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Lady Locksley," he repeated, with the distaste of a man who had encountered her before. Celestine's mind raced through the names she knew from London gossip. Lady Seraphine Locksley was not merely a woman of means. She was a woman of intention, the sort who could weaponize a smile. Celestine stepped into the hallway and looked down the stairs. There below stood the lady. At least, stood the woman people would call a lady regardless of what she did with that title. She wore a gown of such immaculate tailoring that even rain seemed beneath it. At her side was a gentleman with a face that suggested he delighted in paperwork. Malcolm reached the bottom of the stairs too quickly, but Celestine had the sense to hold her own pace. She refused to be dragged into the shape of a scene. Lady Seraphine's gaze swept over Celestine like a blade that pretended to be silk. "There you are." Celestine curtsied. "My lady." Lady Seraphine's smile did not deepen. "My lady," she echoed, and the word was mocking. "How very proper. You have kept your room, I see. How fortunate. I nearly thought I heard a man's voice behind your door." Celestine's spine straightened. "You misheard." Lady Seraphine's attention shifted to Malcolm, and her smile became something sharper. "Oh, not at all." Malcolm's expression hardened. "Lady Locksley, you should not involve yourself with strangers." Lady Seraphine's laugh was light. "Strangers?" "Malcolm," she said his first name as if it belonged to her tongue. Then she corrected herself with a theatrical tilt. "Sir Malcolm Ainsworth, perhaps. Forgive me, men are so difficult to name when they have chosen to be unanchored." Celestine felt something in Malcolm recoil. His flaws were not merely moral, they were personal wounds. Eleanor cleared her throat from behind Celestine, as though trying to remind everyone that the inn was not a stage. Lady Seraphine refused the reminder. "I came for a card," she continued, and produced one from her gloved hand. "I sent for it last night. It appears you have been careless with invitations, Miss Wraxby. It is such an inconvenience for the marriage mart." Celestine's breath caught. Marriage mart. It was the phrase that men and mothers used when they wanted women reduced to prospects. She realized then, Lady Seraphine had not come merely to tease, she had come to perform. The aim was to create a story where Celestine had received unwanted attention and accepted it too readily. Celestine lifted her chin. "My cards are not your concern, my lady." Lady Seraphine stepped closer, and the air filled with perfume. "Your cards," she said, "are always everyone's concern, especially when they are found where they should not be." Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides. Celestine watched him, and in that moment, she understood the danger not only to her reputation, but to his. He was the kind of man who could be pushed into violence by humiliation, and violence, any violence, would be used to destroy them both. Celestine forced herself to speak calmly. "If Lady Seraphine wishes to accuse me," she said, She should do so with witnesses and proof. Lady Seraphine's smile widened. Proof is such a bother. At her words, the gentleman beside her, paper-faced and confident, stepped forward. He produced a folded sheet as if conjuring it. "We have heard," he began, "that there was improper company in Miss Wraxby's chamber last night. We have also been informed that—" Celestine's stomach churned. Improper company? It was a phrase that made bodies into rumors. Malcolm moved. He stepped between Celestine and Lady Seraphine with a speed that startled her. "Enough," he said. Eleanor made a sound of disapproval. Lady Seraphine looked delighted. "Oh, look at him." Her voice rose with the pleasure of an audience forming. "He cannot bear it. He cannot bear that the world sees what he has hidden." Celestine turned her eyes to Lady Seraphine's companion. "You have heard wrong." The man's face remained smug. "We have heard correctly. A gentleman was seen leaving your room at—" At that moment, the innkeeper's assistant, a boy too young to have the sense to be quiet, appeared at the top of the staircase, breathless. "Miss, there's he swallowed, then blurted, "There's a note for you, from a man in the coach house." Celestine's mind snapped toward the coach house. Notes from the coach house meant someone had access to the inn's corridors. Someone had been watching. Lady Seraphine's eyes gleamed. "Oh, how convenient. A note arrives precisely when the air grows uncomfortable." Celestine took the note without looking at it, then handed it to Malcolm. "Read it," she said. Malcolm unfolded the paper with an impatience that felt like a storm in a man's hands. His eyes moved quickly, then stopped. He looked up at Celestine. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, as though trying to hold her own fear in place. Malcolm's voice tightened. "It says the solicitor's men are coming today. It says the house is already measured. It says the title will be seized before nightfall." Celestine's vision narrowed. Lady Seraphine stepped forward again. "And it says, Miss Wraxby, that you will be safest if you marry the man who has been found so inconveniently near you." Celestine's heart thudded. "That is blackmail." Lady Seraphine's smile turned almost kind. "Blackmail, sweetheart, is simply truth dressed for sale." The gentleman with the paper, whose name Celestine did not yet know, spoke then in a tone of practiced authority. "Marry him, Miss Wraxby, and the matter becomes respectable. Refuse, and you become a caution for other girls with inconvenient histories." Celestine felt the room tilt. Here, gossip had become law. She looked at Malcolm, and she saw the genuine flaw in him at last. He could not stand being made a means. He would rather burn himself than submit to being used. "And if I marry you," Celestine said to Malcolm, "will it save my estate?" Malcolm's gaze held hers. "It might," he said, and the uncertainty in his voice made it worse. "Because it will make the claimers hesitate. They want a scandal that cannot be unwound. They want you isolated." Celestine swallowed. "And you?" Malcolm's jaw flexed. "I do not want to be the instrument of their strategy, but I also—" He stopped as though he disliked confessing weakness. "As well?" Eleanor prompted, perhaps without meaning to. Malcolm's eyes softened, just enough to be dangerous. "As well, I cannot allow you to be taken." Celestine's eyes stung. She blinked it away. Lady Seraphine clapped once, bright and pleased. "There, you see, he does not deny it. He does not deny caring." How very romantic, in the ugliest possible way. Celestine looked at Eleanor. "Is it true?" she asked. "Was Malcolm seen leaving my room?" Eleanor's gaze flicked away and then returned. "He was seen at your door," she admitted. "Not leaving, standing. And then—" "Then what?" Celestine demanded. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Then Lady Seraphine sent word that you had asked for assistance, miss. She insisted the situation was intimate. Celestine's mind snapped into place. The note's intention was not only to threaten seizure, it was to create a narrative so that any counter-narrative would be dismissed. Lady Seraphine had planned it. Celestine turned slowly toward Lady Seraphine. "You are attempting to force a proposal as payment for silence." Lady Seraphine's smile did not falter. "I am attempting to save you from worse. It is a pity you are so determined to misunderstand kindness." Celestine's hands clenched at her sides. She was furious enough to accept violence or scandal, furious enough to agree simply to end the argument. But then she remembered her mother's letter, the one she had not yet opened. She remembered her mother's handwriting, neat and firm and unmistakably intelligent. Her mother had written as if women could outwit any man who thought them limited. Celestine looked at Malcolm again. "If I marry you," she said, "I do so with my eyes open." Malcolm's expression shifted, relief and dread both. "And if you lie," Celestine continued, her voice sharpening, "I will destroy you." "I deserve that," Malcolm said hoarsely. Lady Seraphine's eyes narrowed with impatience. "Enough poetry. When?" Celestine breathed in. She could feel the world leaning toward a verdict. "Tonight," she said. The common room inhaled. Even Eleanor looked startled. Celestine continued, unhurried. "We will marry tonight, in private. There will be witnesses, legal ones, not gossip ones. And before the solicitor's men arrive at dusk, we will present the marriage certificate and demand a stay on the entail's enforcement pending review." Lady Seraphine blinked. "Review?" Celestine's voice remained calm. "If you intend to weaponize law, my lady, then you will meet law of my choosing." Malcolm stared at her, as if he had forgotten women could be strategic. Lady Seraphine's gaze hardened. "A marriage requires propriety." Celestine turned toward Eleanor. "Eleanor, you will fetch the rector, and you will do it quickly, and you will do it without telling half the county." Eleanor hesitated, then she nodded once, an oath disguised as agreement. Lady Seraphine's face flickered, and Celestine saw something like disappointment. Lady Seraphine had wanted a scene in public, a narrative with witnesses and laughter. Celestine intended to steal the stage. Within the hour, the inn became a hive of controlled motion. Not a carriage drove away, only a messenger ran to fetch the rector. Malcolm remained near Celestine, speaking little, as if any word might crack him. Celestine, meanwhile, took her mother's letter from her chest. She had not dared open it in the common presence of panic. Now she opened it with hands steady enough to feel brave. Her mother's handwriting filled the page. Celestine read of a secret arrangement between her mother and Malcolm's father, an arrangement that had been broken by the same man behind the entail leverage. Celestine's mother had promised to protect a set of documents that would prove the entitlement's legitimacy had been manipulated, and she had instructed Celestine to locate Malcolm if the entail's seizure began. "Mother," Celestine whispered, and her throat tightened. "You did not trust the law. You trusted me." Malcolm heard her voice and leaned closer. "What does she say?" Celestine looked at him and felt the sting of guilt. "She says you were never a drifter," she replied. "Not in the way they intend." Malcolm's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Celestine read aloud a line that made the world tilt. Her mother had written, "Malcolm's father had not died in truth. He had been coerced into leaving documents behind, believing he could bargain with the same villain who now held Celestine's claim. Malcolm had been sent away to prevent him from being used as a pawn." Celestine folded the letter carefully. "Someone has been hunting you," she said. Malcolm's face darkened. "I know. I've always known." It was said with bitterness, not romance. Celestine reached for his sleeve and held it, surprisingly gentle. "Then why did you come here?" Malcolm's eyes met hers and held. "Because when I learned your name," he said, "I realized they might be hunting you through me." And because you wanted to stop it, Celestine guessed. And because I could not bear the thought of you being taken, Malcolm corrected, voice rough. There. It was the truth behind his flawed sense of control. He had not come to court her. He had come because he had made a habit of being too late for other people's tragedies, and this time he refused to be. The rector arrived just before dusk, accompanied by 2 witnesses in plain coats. Eleanor kept watch near the door, her face set in solemn competence. The marriage was performed quickly, not hurried but deliberate. Celestine's own mind remained sharp. She spoke her vows as though placing stakes in the ground. When it was done, the rector's hands lifted the paper so that it could be inspected. Malcolm's name was written with a flourish that made him look more legitimate than he felt. Lady Seraphine did not appear, but gossip was never truly absent. It only waited. As soon as the ceremony ended, Malcolm exhaled and looked at Celestine with a helpless expression that made his flaws visible. His temper, his pride, his habit of thinking he could fix disaster alone. Now he was married to the woman disaster had targeted. Now he belonged to her in a way that could either protect her or destroy him further. Celestine did not pretend she was unshaken. She felt the ache of it in her ribs. Her reputation had not been saved by triumph. It had been purchased by courage and speed. They moved back into her chamber. The air seemed quieter there, as if the room could no longer contain what had happened. Celestine sat by the table and stared at her mother's letter. Malcolm stood by the window. Outside, the storm had eased slightly, the rain now more obedient to the earth. "You still have your estate," Malcolm said softly. "Legally. For now." Celestine nodded. "Legally for now," she agreed. "And emotionally?" Malcolm asked, and there was something raw in it. Celestine looked at him. "Emotionally," she said, "it is propriety as torture. One day you are a stranger in my hallway, the next you are my husband by necessity." Malcolm's mouth twitched. "You make it sound like I forced you." Celestine met his gaze without flinching. "You did." He went still. "I did not mean—" "I know what you did not mean," Celestine interrupted gently. "But you arrived at the door with evidence, with suspicion, with half-truths. You let the situation become dangerous rather than arranging it safely." Malcolm's shoulders sagged. "You are right." Celestine's anger did not disappear, but it transformed. Anger became focus. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the moment you stepped into that inn until now. No bargaining. No excuses." Malcolm's eyes held hers. "You will not enjoy it." "Then I will enjoy the truth," Celestine replied. Malcolm sat at last. His hands were restless, folding and unfolding his coat, as though he could iron his own guilt into something neat. He spoke of a ledger he had stolen years ago, an attempt to find his father's missing documents. He spoke of meeting a man in London who had promised to help him retrieve the ledger in exchange for silence. Malcolm had agreed, thinking the help would be honest. It had not been. He spoke of being followed to this region, of learning about an estate entailed to Celestine's family, and about his belief that her mother's letter could be the key to what was missing. He spoke of the messenger he had taken from, the messenger who had been struck down not by accident, but by someone sent to stop him. Malcolm had arrived too late to prevent the messenger's collapse, and then too early to know whether Celestine would be ruined or spared. Celestine listened with the steady patience of a woman refusing to be fooled by charm. When he finished, she held her breath. "I caught you," Malcolm said at last, voice quiet. "Last night." Celestine frowned slightly. "You mean when you confronted me?" "No," he swallowed. "After the door opened, after you were searching for the letter, before the corridor sound." Celestine's heart tightened. "You mean there was someone else?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "I found Lady Seraphine's man at the stair with a bundle of papers. He had your calling card. He intended to place it in your hand and drag you into the story. I moved to stop him. I grabbed what was within reach." Celestine stared. "And what was within reach?" Malcolm's eyes lowered. "Your letter," he confessed. "The one that should have been sealed. I broke the wax to see if the solicitor's terms were different than the copy I'd seen in London." Celestine's breath caught. "You broke the seal." Malcolm flinched. "I did." "I know that makes me worse." Celestine's mind whirred, then settled into clarity. That was why the seal in her possession still appeared unbroken, because he had taken it from somewhere else. A duplicate might exist, or the seal could have been replaced. She realized then that this scandal was more complex than a single rumor. It was a web of documents, seals, and performance. "Why show me the seal at all?" Celestine asked. Malcolm looked up. "Because I panicked," he admitted. "Because I thought you might be the person I needed. Because in that moment, I did not know if you deserved my interference." "And now?" Celestine asked. Malcolm's gaze softened, and his pride warred with honesty. "Now I know you do," he said simply. Celestine should have rolled her eyes at the sentimental shape of the words. Instead, she felt the slow ache behind them. They were married, yes, but they were also strangers no longer, a fact made difficult by the fact that she had always demanded she be treated as a mind, not a body. Celestine turned her face slightly away. "My agency does not vanish because I am married," she said. "I know," Malcolm replied. "Then help me," she said, "with your flaws if you must, but do not hide behind propriety when it would harm me." Malcolm's eyes widened slightly. "That is the first thing you have asked that I can do without resentment." Celestine looked back. "Good, then do it." The next hours became a private war. Malcolm produced a small portfolio from his coat, stitched leather worn at the edges. Inside were copies of documents and a map of a counting house in London with a marked shelf and a date. Celestine recognized the shelf location. Her mother's letter mentioned a similar spot. Together, they drafted a plan. A visit to the inn's records to find when certain calling cards had been delivered. A quiet inquiry with Eleanor about who entered Celestine's corridor, and a demand to the solicitor's men for a postponement of seizure because Celestine was now legally married. Marriage would not annul corruption. It would, however, complicate it. As night deepened, Celestine found herself seated beside Malcolm. He had loosened his cravat, a gesture that made him seem suddenly vulnerable. He was not charming now. He was simply tired. In that tiredness, his flaws softened from weapons into evidence of humanity. Celestine, despite herself, reached for his hand. Her fingers brushed his knuckles, calloused, real. Malcolm looked down at their hands as though he had never allowed himself to believe the possibility of touch without consequence. "You are angry," he said. "I am furious," Celestine corrected, "but I am also exhausted." Malcolm's eyes lifted to hers. "Furious women are the most dangerous," he murmured. Celestine's smile, small and genuine, surprised her. "Only because men refuse to behave." Malcolm's mouth curved. "Then I shall behave." Celestine tilted her head. "Will you?" He hesitated, and Celestine saw the old habit returning, the impulse to take control and fix the world by force rather than by negotiation. Then he steadied himself. "I will," he said, "if you command me." Celestine's chest tightened. That was agency too, his, offered willingly. She nodded once. "Then you will begin by telling me the whole truth about the man behind the entail." Malcolm's gaze sharpened. "You already suspect him." Celestine did not deny it. "He used a marriage-mart tactic. He used a lady's perfume to build a witness. He will not stop at seizure. If he thinks you can be used, he will use you as well." Malcolm's jaw set. "He tried." "And?" Celestine asked. Malcolm looked at her as if he feared the answer might wound him further. "And I ran," he said. "Not because I was brave, because I was ashamed." Celestine absorbed that revelation. His shame was a flaw, yes, but it also made him honest. He was not the charming villain. He was the wounded man who had learned to mask himself with motion. The dawn that followed arrived brighter, as if the storm had exhausted itself on drama. Eleanor came with tea and a folded set of carriage schedules. "There are men at the gate," Eleanor said, and her voice had the weary edge of someone who had already endured the worst of other people's plots. "Solicitors' men. They say they will arrive at noon." Celestine stood, the letter in her hand and Malcolm's portfolio tucked under his arm. "Then noon will be a battlefield," she said calmly. Malcolm glanced at her. "You fear it?" "No," Celestine replied. "I fear wasting time." When the solicitors' men arrived, they brought with them the certainty of law and the arrogance of men accustomed to women being late to their own destinies. Their leader was a cheerful man with ink-stained cuffs, his smile practiced. "Miss Wraxby," he called. Celestine did not correct him at first. She let the title settle like dust. Then she lifted her chin. "Mrs. Ainsworth," she said. The change in her name seemed to disorient him. Malcolm stood beside her, not as a rescuer, but as a participant. When the solicitor's men demanded entry to measure and seize, Celestine produced the marriage certificate. They stared at it as though paper could be argued into insignificance. The cheerful solicitor's smile tightened. "A marriage for convenience?" he suggested. Celestine's eyes did not waver. "A marriage for protection," she corrected. "And protection for what?" the solicitor asked, leaning into his own performance. Celestine answered with a calm that felt almost cruel. "For the truth. My mother left documents that contest the entail's legitimacy. If you seize without review, you will invite scrutiny. If you delay, you will be held in contempt for interfering with a lawful marriage's effect." The solicitor's men shifted slightly, and Celestine saw it. Uncertainty, the tiny crack in confident cruelty. This was the propriety as torture that had been prepared for her, not only to trap her in scandal, but to trap her in the assumption that women could not speak law back to men. Celestine had been waiting for a moment like this. Malcolm, watching her, looked at her as though she were a revelation. His gaze held both pride and regret. The solicitor's leader consulted a smaller man, then, with the reluctant air of a man conceding something he disliked, he offered a postponement. Not kindness, strategy. Celestine took it anyway. When the men left, Eleanor exhaled so hard it sounded like surrender. Celestine turned to Malcolm. He looked exhausted, but there was a steadiness in him now, as though marrying her had anchored him and freed him to do what he should have done from the beginning. "We must go to London," Malcolm said quietly. Celestine nodded. "Yes. And we must do so before the man behind the entail can scramble the papers again," Malcolm added. Celestine's eyes narrowed. "We will find the shelf," she said, thinking of the map, "and we will retrieve what my mother hid." Malcolm's throat moved. "And then?" Celestine looked at him, and her voice softened to something that ached. "Then we stop playing defense. Then we take our lives back." Malcolm's gaze held hers, and the tenderness in it was slow to arrive but no longer denied. "I did not intend to become your husband," he said. Celestine's expression warmed, but she did not allow him to turn it into a romantic lie. "I did not intend to become anyone's salvation," she replied. "But you did become my husband." Malcolm's mouth curved faintly. "That sounds like resentment." "It is," Celestine admitted. "And it is also gratitude." Malcolm's eyes softened. "Then perhaps you might let me earn the rest," he said. Celestine's heart tightened. Earn. She thought of Lady Seraphine's perfume, of the corridor, of the nearly fabricated scandal that would have turned her into an example. She thought of Malcolm's flaw, the impatience that could have ruined her. He had not ruined her. He had, in his flawed way, chosen to stand between her and the story they wanted. Celestine reached for his hand again. This time, he did not flinch. "I will let you earn it," she said. "But I warn you, mister. Malcolm Ainsworth, husband by necessity or not, I will not be conquered by propriety." Malcolm's laugh was quiet and honest. "Good," he replied, "because I am tired of being dragged through other people's rules." They left the coaching inn that afternoon with the morning's drama still clinging to them like damp cloth. The sky cleared just enough to make the road look forgiving. Celestine understood it was only an appearance, yet as the carriage carried them toward London, Malcolm leaned closer and spoke so softly that only she could hear. "I have one more truth," he said. Celestine's breath caught. "Speak." "I did not merely break the seal because I panicked," Malcolm admitted. "I broke it because I recognized the crest. It belongs to the man who once employed my father, one who promised protection and delivered betrayal. And I—" His voice tightened. "I recognized the pattern. Your mother's letter was proof. Proof that I could not fix my own debts alone." Celestine blinked, understanding blooming slowly. "So you chose to bind yourself to me," she said. Malcolm nodded once. Celestine looked out the carriage window at the passing hedges and imagined Lady Seraphine's disappointed face. She imagined the solicitor's men recalculating their threats. She turned back, and the slow ache of the last days became something steadier. "Then we shall face the marriage mart together," Celestine said, voice calm. "If they try to bargain my worth for your disgrace, I shall bargain louder. We will let gossip choke on its own certainty." Malcolm's eyes glimmered with something like devotion, but tempered by his flaws, tempered by his honesty. "I want you," he said. Celestine's cheeks warmed. "That is a dangerous statement." "I know," Malcolm replied, and the genuine flaw in him, his inability to hide desire under polite distance, was visible even now. "But I am done being careful in the wrong way." Celestine drew a slow breath. She did not pretend that a scandal could be undone by feeling. She did not pretend that law would heal itself. But she could choose the man beside her. "Then stay," she said. Malcolm's hand covered hers, firm and warm. "I have been staying," he replied. "I only arrived late to the decision." The carriage wheels struck the road and carried them onward. Somewhere behind them, the inn's common room would fill with rumors. Some would twist, some would fail. Celestine could not control gossip, but she could control her own story now. And in the quiet between 1 mile and the next, as propriety loosened its cruel grip just enough to allow tenderness to breathe, Celestine understood the deepest truth of her situation. She had been stranded at a coaching inn, and he, flawed, stubborn, honest in his worst moments, had refused to leave her there.